Welcome to BuildForce Canada's Productivity Series. Each episode will focus on one aspect of productivity. We hope you'll find them informative and useful as we all strive to improve our competitiveness. Remember, how we work is how we win.
My name is Sandra McGilvery. I'm the Managing Director here at Valency. I've had the pleasure of working with the Construction Industry Institute for many years, and we represent both the Construction Industry Institute and the Project Management Institute as registered education providers. We've worked in research in the area of risk management over the past number of years with CII, and look forward to sharing with you some of the great practices that have been developed over the past 20 years in this area. To get started, I just want to give you a little bit of background on Valency. We take a total solutions approach to helping our clients implement construction industry best practices, including risk management that we'll be focused on here today. As we take a look at what our solution offering includes, we do structured assessments of project management practices to provide our clients with insights and help them prioritize where to invest for continuous improvement. We provide implementation services for project management practices, including risk management. We do educational courses on CII best practices, and our team of facilitators conducts PDRI reviews and risk workshops around the world for our clients. So the focus of today's webinar is on introducing the Construction Industry Institute's risk management best practices and how you can implement these practices for effective risk management in capital projects. Over the course of the webinar, we'll walk through this discussion, starting with an introduction to the risk management process. We'll highlight the benefits of risk management and how it can improve your cost and schedule certainty. We'll walk through the steps in the risk management process, focusing specifically on how they apply to capital projects. And finally, we'll introduce our Roadmap to Success program and some of the educational opportunities that are available to help in implementing CII risk management best practices. To get us started, the definition of project risk that comes from the Project Management Institute is an uncertain event or condition that if it occurs, it may have a positive or a negative effect on your project objectives. So often we only think about project risk in terms of the negative, but it really comes back to focusing on the uncertainty of that event or condition. Project risk management refers to the process of controlling those positive and negative effects so that we can ensure we have a successful project. And our role in capital project is really going to have a pretty big influence on our perception of what risks are. And what may be a risk for an owner may not be a risk for a contractor. So if you're an owner, the primary risks that we normally are concerned with include certainty of your capital, your operating, and your maintenance costs. Do you have proper qualifications of your designers and contractors? You may have some technological uncertainty that's top of your list. Now, if you're a designer and you're responsible for exercising proper judgment and diligence and performing design and engineering duties, you may be much more concerned with making sure you've done a thorough evaluation of alternatives, that you've looked at all the local codes and regulations and safety requirements, and are there any pending changes that might affect that, and also making sure you've got provisions for adequate design and specifications. And finally, if you're in the role of a contractor, you face a wide array of risk with every project you're engaged with, and your focus includes different risks like labor availability and their productivity. Do you have the proper qualifications for all of your subcontractors and suppliers? Are you at risk of any labor interruptions or strikes? And does the owner have the ability to provide a well-defined scope for you to start with? So in addition, depending on how contracts are written, the risks for a differing site conditions, a really important one for us all, they could be a contractor risk or they may be transferred from the contractor to the owner. So lots of varying perceptions of where risk comes from. Over the past 10 years, the practice of risk management has received significant attention from our large capital projects, and many of our organizations have seen firsthand the benefits of adopting a formal risk management plan in some of those larger projects. And they include things like enhanced collaboration and discussion among our stakeholders when we focus on risk, And when we initiate those risk identification sessions early in our project, we have an opportunity to really proactively work through risk responses and manage that risk. When a risk register starts to become included as a regular project communication tool, there's also an increased transparency on risk that's for the benefit of the entire team and your stakeholder group. And all of these steps help put our project leaders in a position where you can act with increased confidence and really act decisively. And finally, the statistics really tell the story. Managing risk clearly helps us manage project schedule and cost certainty with more effectiveness. And the great news is that even if these benefits started to mature in our larger projects, they're fully achievable and scalable based on the size of project and the complexity that you're working with today. Let's take a look at some of the benchmarking data from the Construction Industry Institute. CII benchmarks research around project performance, and when it comes to risk management, their data shows that organizations with a formal risk management process see about a 10.1% reduction in schedule growth. Similarly, if we have formal risk management processes in place, it's going to also impact our cost performance. The CII benchmarking data gives us even more specific insight here, showing that if you have that risk management process in place and it's initiated before the project is authorized, those projects see a 9.4% reduction in cost growth over those projects that will wait until after project authorization or usually into detailed design to initiate their risk management process. So powerful numbers for us to consider. So CII's recommended risk management process has 5 primary steps. The first step is risk identification, where the risks that may affect your projects are identified and documented. The second step is risk assessment, where you complete an assessment of those identified risks and think about potential cost or schedule impact. And with that information in hand, your project team can better prioritize the order in which they respond to those risks. The third step in the process is risk analysis, which refers to techniques to perform quantitative risk analysis. The fourth step is developing risk responses, where your project team will determine the most appropriate strategy and the actions for each of the risks that they've identified. And the final step in this iterative process is monitoring and controlling project risk. Just like we monitor and control project cost and schedule performance throughout a project, this step involves reviewing progress on the agreed-upon risk responses, reviewing changes in your risk exposure, and continuing to identify additional risk as the project progresses. As we continue through the webinar today, we'll use a term called risk workshop. And given risk management is an iterative process, risk workshops refers to that step of identifying and assessing risk throughout the life cycle of the project. As we transition into more detail about the steps in formal risk management, the number one critical success factor that we'd encourage you to keep in mind is that formal risk management really is a process. It's not just a one-time event. And just because we're working with different sizes of projects sometimes, we may be working with smaller or mid-sized projects, that doesn't mean that the risk management process should end after we've been through it once. Depending on the complexity of your project, risk can continue to evolve over time. When developing your risk management process, you need to consider how we're going to best serve the needs of the size of project and the complexity you're working with. But in general, for larger projects, CII recommends conducting risk review meetings in the early phases of the project lifecycle. This can start at the end of business planning, prior to your decision to proceed with the project, can happen during feasibility, and should happen prior to the completion of detailed scope. Now, in our experience with smaller projects, having a more compressed front-end planning effort is pretty common, and conducting one risk review session during that front-end planning effort is generally sufficient. As your project continues into the execution phases, we recommend planning a risk workshop early in the detailed design, the construction, and again at commissioning phase. An important consideration we need to talk about is introducing the risk workshops that may represent a significant change in process for small and mid-sized project teams. Everyone is pressed for time, And we need to expect that we're going to get some pushback as we introduce yet another potential meeting in your project process. So my suggestions as we work through each of these follow-up steps is think through the benchmarks that we share here today and be able to bring that back as kind of demonstrated proof of how this is actually making an impact in the industry. So let's take a look at some of the most effective strategies that are going to give you a very efficient risk management process to work with. We'll start with there are many strategies that can be used to initiate risk identification, but the most effective ones that we have seen in capital projects from CII research, first of all, the traditional brainstorming process. This is the most common strategy that's used with project stakeholders and subject matter experts and experts that you may bring in from externally. And a brainstorming session is going to be most effective if it's led by an external facilitator from that project team. And a strong facilitator will help your team run a structured session so that it creates a really safe environment where everybody feels comfortable providing input. And most importantly, that it avoids any biases that may be in the room in favor of some really strong personalities. The second strategy that's commonly used is conducting structured interviews. And this is done using a prepared set of questions that you follow so that the conversation is structured and yet it allows opportunity to explore issues that may arise during that discussion. Structured interviews are often used in conjunction with conducting a brainstorming session. The two together make sure that you still get input from any of the key individuals or experts or senior leaders who may not be able to attend the brainstorming session for various reasons. The third strategy for identifying risk is to complete a thorough review of your project documentation. So some of the most important, going through your project charter, your business case, project scope and design documents, your project execution plan, and of course your cost estimate and your project schedule. Now, if your project has used the Project Definition Rating Index or PDRI to assess the level of scope definition, that PDRI summary report is also an ideal document to review. It will normally have both identified gaps as well as risks that came through the session. The fourth strategy that's very effective is using a risk identification checklist. Many organizations will develop a list of historical risks based on their lessons learned from similar types of projects. In 2014, CII conducted a research team that I had the privilege of serving on, and we published a special report on risk management and identified 27 publications over the course of history with CII that were related to risk identification. And this year, my team here completed a review of all of those publications and developed a risk identification checklist that has over 150 of the most common risks in capital projects. And this is one of those key resources that if you don't have something to start with, it's a great place to start that you can then add additional information to. Following a structured process as you go through risk identification is really important so that stakeholders have confidence that you're following a well-organized and efficient process. We recommend using a risk breakdown structure so that it forms an agenda when you're conducting your brainstorming session or even organizing the risks that you've identified. The example that we've provided here aligns with how we organized our risk identification checklist. And just like a work breakdown structure, your risk breakdown structure needs to be fit for purpose for your organization, as well as the size and complexity of the project that you have at hand. Working through a risk breakdown structure through risk management ensures that you've done a comprehensive review of each of the potential areas of uncertainty. It'll help promote consistency in how risk management is done project to project, and it also makes efficient use of everyone's time who participates in the risk identification step. Our primary supporting tool in risk management is the risk register, and identifying risks as they are captured using this tool is a best practice that should be followed. As we identify the risks that are captured through team discussions, we want to make sure we have a structured description of each risk. We'll want to make sure we've captured what phase we expect it will occur in. And then finally, we want to understand the primary impact, which is normally cost or schedule, although additional parameters can be used as organizations become more mature with risk management. Now, writing structured risk descriptions is not a natural kind of thing that comes at first glance, but it is a pretty highly trainable skill. There's always going to be different styles of writing these descriptions, but we want to just make sure that you capture things with consistency. And the one method that we find that seems to come most natural to project stakeholders is, first of all, start with naming the risk or the uncertainty that it's been identified. Secondly, we need to concisely state the cause of the risk, meaning the fact or the condition behind it. And then third, we want to capture the effect of that potential risk or the possible result if that risk occurs. So to give you an example of what that looks like, let's take a look at this recent building project. The team identified a risk as potential presence of asbestos. The cause of the risk was that it may be discovered when demoing a 1970s warehouse. And finally, the possible effect is that it could result in additional costs to the project. CII offers a number of risk register templates. The most applicable template that we have found for clients is the implementation resource 280-2. They have multiple templates that you can use, but the Level 2 risk register that supports qualitative risk identification and assessment has proved to be the most useful. It's easy to use, and you can capture the risk descriptions and the expected phase and that things are going to occur and follow it through the process. We'll do a walkthrough of this risk register template here shortly. So CII's risk management practice provides guidance on how to consider the best level of risk assessment that you should do in your project. What they call Level 1 involves only identification of risk, and it doesn't require the assessment step. As an example, if you have a $500,000 project that involves procurement and replacement of one major piece of equipment, you may only have a short list of identified risks that can easily be addressed without any further assessment. Level 2 we would refer to as qualitative or deterministic risk assessment. Adding the assessment step involves considering the impact and probability of each risk and then prioritizing your list of risks. Qualitative risk assessment takes more time, but even for a $5 million project, you can easily have 15 to 25 identified risks. When we take the time to consider both probability and impact, that allows us to prioritize our efforts in developing risk responses. Finally, Level 3 is referred to as quantitative or probabilistic risk analysis. Level 3 involves additional analysis through probability distribution and provides us with a cost and schedule estimate at a desired level of certainty. Normally, Level 3 analysis is used in our larger capital projects as it requires significantly more time, and a qualitative risk assessment must first be completed to provide input into the process. For contractors, quantitative or probabilistic risk analysis often becomes a necessity to determine the appropriate contingency amount to have in large bids. Given our focus today is a broad audience, we're going to focus in on the middle here on our Level 2 qualitative risk assessment. So with risks all identified in our previous step, your project team is now ready to assess each risk potential impact on both cost and schedule. The team assesses each risk based on both impact and probability. One of the greatest things about starting with CII risk register templates is that they come pre-configured with impact and probability tables that can be customized based on your project parameters, including your project value, your project duration, and the estimated value of 1 day's delay in completing the project on schedule. Out of the box, the risk register templates have impact tables for both cost and schedule. Each table has 5 levels of impact, and a range of values for each level is provided as guidance derived from CII research. However, you have the opportunity to modify those so that they're appropriate to your risk requirements within your individual project. The second pre-configured component in the risk register template is the probability table. Again, we have 5 levels with default low and high values provided as guidance derived from CII research. In both impact and probability tables, The ranges can be configured to meet your specific risk assessment parameters. As the team works through assessment of the level of impact and probability of each risk, the level values are entered into the risk register. The level is selected automatically and helps define the mean value. And the two values are used to calculate a risk's overall ranking, high, medium, or low, as well as the mean value on a dollar basis. The risk mean dollar value becomes useful in scenarios like this one, where all four risks are considered medium, and we need additional information to rank their severity. Another useful strategy for ranking risks is to use a heat map. Medium risks and visually considering the range of probability and impact can help make ranking the severity of these risks much easier. The example shown here comes from Valency's Risk Register dashboard that we'll talk more about shortly. I'd like to share a few examples of the types of outcomes that can come in a facilitated risk workshop. One great example happened in a risk workshop for a project to raise the height of the existing wastewater pond dike by driving new steel sheet piles along the dike. The pond was originally constructed in the late 1950s to hold the oily wastewater. In the late 1990s, a new technology of biological treatment was introduced, and the water level needed to be raised to add oxygen. The contractor was given the original as-built drawings and planned to drive the sheet piles along the dike. The contractor's project manager asked if there would be any culverts or pipes or anything else buried in there, but no one in the company seemed to be able to confirm. He figured it was time for his risk workshop and made sure that there was good representation from the owner's operations team at that assessment. An operator who had worked in the area for about 40 years attended that risk workshop and confirmed that the dike had actually been modified twice and there were revision drawings made. A 24-inch culvert pipe was added, but later abandoned and sealed using concrete at both ends when the affluent route was changed. It was pretty clear to everyone in the room that if they had not, that they would have eventually hit that culvert pipe, which would have caused untreated wastewater to leak into the marshland. The contractor's project manager asked for those revised drawings. It took the owner a couple days to get them to them, and they were able to modify their plan accordingly. So responding to that risk did add some cost and did add some time, but the mitigation prevented a potentially disastrous risk from occurring. Time and time again, we see these types of risks with projects involving substantial renovation and revamp work. Let's move on to our next step, risk responses. The second critical success factor that we'd like to hit home with today is that you can have a great risk workshop, but if your team doesn't take the next step of developing risk responses, you've left the team with a false sense of security. We have to develop a response for each of the risks if we want to reduce the likelihood of occurrence or its impact, or both. There are four main strategies when it comes to developing risk responses. The first one is avoid, and this is any strategy that we can take that will ensure that the risk has no effect on the project. It normally has to be done pretty early in the project. The second strategy is to transfer, and in this strategy, we can transfer risk to another party that should be better positioned to address the risk. And some of the examples would include insurance and outsourcing to a better party that can handle that risk. Mitigate, this is the most widely used risk response, and the approach is to identify a set of actions that your team can follow that will reduce either the probability or the impact of that risk, or both. And finally, we may choose to accept, and this strategy involves taking no action unless the risk actually occurs. So the project team would normally develop a contingency plan ahead of time, and that will only be implemented if the risk occurs. Let's take a look at an example of capturing risk responses. We have an identified risk where disruption to operations during the HVAC replacement may occur because of poor coordination of installation with the operations and result in suspended operations to protect health of personnel. So the team considers various options, and in the end, the simplest answer is simply to avoid installing during regular operations and ensure this is scheduled for a weekend replacement. In our risk response example above, the project team went through this project. In our case study, the project team went through a process of considering the cost and benefit of potential responses. This involves considering the inherent risk value. So what is the risk dollar value if we do nothing? We have a calculated risk value from our risk assessment that allows everyone to be a little bit more objective about the discussion around a specific risk. We then have to consider the cost of responding to that risk, as well as the residual risk value. The costs include both the cost to respond to and the cost to implement, and the residual value refers to how much risk remains after we've implemented that response. In most cases, we can mitigate risks, and that will reduce it from, say, a high to a low risk rating, but even when it's reduced to low, the risk probably still carries some value. An example where cost-benefit analysis was key was a project to build a 50-kilometer pipeline where the preferred route would cross 2 ranches. The project team had identified a risk that the regulatory approval could be delayed because of rancher objections. The team estimated this could add up to 3-month delay to the project. The project team had to tackle this risk and take action, but there were different options that would allow them to mitigate, accept, or even avoid the risk if they could come up with an alternate route. Each risk response had a different cost and a different benefit. The project team ultimately settled on a mitigation action of contacting the ranchers and offering compensation before they publicly raised objections to the applications. Even with this option, there was a maximum that the company was willing to pay to each rancher based on the impact of the 3-month delay. Ultimately, the identified risks were effectively mitigated and the potential delay was avoided. Now that we've walked through each step in the risk management process, we've walked through the previous steps in the risk management process, let's take a quick look through our risk register template to see this in action. I'm going to switch over to my spreadsheet at this point in time. So I've got a number of tabs along the bottom that I'm going to walk you through, but the very first one I'm going to start with is our Instructions tab. And you'll remember I explained that this template is very configurable and that we can include both our project value, the duration of the project, and the value of a 1-day delay to help drive through the variables that we have for both cost and schedule impact. We can also configure the project phases here so that they reflect the phases that you use in your project management process. Next, we move over to our Input tab. You'll remember we walked through both the impact and the probability tables that we explained were configurable. And CII provides recommended ranges for each of these tables, but wherever you see yellow boxes, these are available to be configured to meet your organization's specific parameters. At the bottom, we also have our heat map that will be used to assign overall risk rankings. In this example, if we have a risk that's a low impact but a high probability, we've color-coded this one to be a medium risk. If we actually want to move that up to a medium high or a high, we simply have to click through our heat map to be able to configure that to reflect through within our risk register. Moving on to our Identification tab, this is where the project team will capture each identified risk along with the relevant phase that a risk occurs in, as well as whether we figure it is primarily a cost or a schedule impact. The next step that we walked through in our risk management process was the assessment. Let's take a look at assigning the assessment. The first step that we have after going through discussion with the project team is to establish what's the most likely impact. And if we have a low value based on the parameters for the project, it populates our mean value for that risk. If we change it to a medium, those values are updated accordingly. Similarly, we'll go through and determine what our most likely probability is. The probability percentages are populated based on our Input tab that we had up front. If we have a schedule-driven risk, working through our impact is calculated in terms of number of days. So again, changing the likely impact changes the number of days that are applied. And moving over to the far side, when we multiply our probability times our impact, we gain both a risk mean value, So we can rank the risks based on their priority, and we also get our overall risk ranking based on the heat map that we defined. The next tab that we have is our risk response tab. So the first step that we have in recording our risk responses is to document what our strategy is to avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept, to document a brief description of the risk response, and very important is who our risk owner is and what our estimated cost of that response is. If we are tracking trigger events for a risk that we've decided to accept, that is also important. The final step after we've responded to risks is that we should have a situation where the response we implement lowers the likely impact as well and potentially the probability. That we'll input what our post or after we've responded, what that impact and probability is, and we'll have our post-response value, and hopefully we've taken risks from potentially a high to a medium or a medium to a low risk ranking. The final tab that we have here is our summary, and often this would be a report that you would run to identify where we're at with all of our risks. It's going to include all the summary information that you would need to report back to your team. And then the final tab is our risk dashboard, which we'll walk through in more detail here shortly. With our summary report and our dashboard in mind from the risk register, let's transition into that final step of monitoring and controlling risk. Taking the step of including risk monitoring as part of your regular project status meetings is one of the most crucial steps towards making risk management part of your project culture. This is where you can keep your team focused on the identified risk. You can track your team's progress on executing those planned risk responses, as well as putting contingency plans into place. One of the most effective ways to support this step is to have a risk status report or dashboard that provides your team with a very concise update on risk, just like we would provide an update on cost or schedule performance at a monthly status meeting. The risk status report example that you see here was generated using that risk register dashboard. Let's take a quick walk through the components of this report. In the top left-hand corner, we start with a review of the current status of identified risks. It helps us understand how many new risks we've had in the past month, how many have been closed, and of our active risks, how many of them have responses and how many of them do not. Next, we can lead the team through a concise discussion on the top 10 risks based on our post-response risk ranking. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have a breakdown of our risk by project phase, including visibility to the number of risks that haven't got responses yet. If your team is currently in front-end planning and you've identified a number of risks, it may be reasonable for you to develop risk responses for those that will occur in front-end planning and potentially into detailed design, but you may have to wait until you have more information to be able to address the remaining risks that you have out here in construction phase. And finally, the heat map graphically depicts how these risks are distributed based on both probability and impact. Very quickly, your entire team can see that addressing this risk number 5, which related back to a delay in environmental approvals, is by far the biggest risk that the team can address. As you progress through each phase of the project, we also want to make sure that we do conduct those planned risk workshops to monitor for new risks in the project. And the best strategy that we found to make this happen is simply build those risk workshops into the early project schedule as key milestones to complete. As we consider these barriers, I think the really good news is that with a strong implementation plan, the benefits of effective risk management can be achieved on very wide variety of project sizes and complexity. It simply comes down to addressing each of these barriers up front. So if we drill down into a few of these, we need to make sure we've considered appropriate training for both our project managers that often get tasked with leading risk management, as well as our project team members, because that buy-in and support from the broader team really becomes critical to the participation in the process. Next, we need to address the time required and make sure that we scale our risk management process to effectively fit the project size and complexity. And the standard operating procedure that may work very well for your large projects will definitely need to be adapted so that it continues to deliver value and risk management for your smaller project teams. And finally, we need to make sure we give our project teams effective tools. And CII has a wealth of publications that you can utilize. With over 32 publications over the past number of years in support of risk management, it actually can be almost a little bit overwhelming for your smaller projects. But I think the good news is that there's been lots of consolidation done to make that easier to adopt. So this is one of the areas that we at Valency have focused in, and we've carefully considered the barriers and incorporated that into our risk management Roadmap to Success program. We've used the same approach for implementing front-end planning practices, including PDRI. And this program has been designed specifically to implement risk management using lessons learned from the industry. So there's really 4 components that we found will help make this a successful implementation. And the first is including formal classroom training as part of our program. That kicks off with a 2-day workshop designed for all of your project stakeholders that would normally participate in risk workshops. Day 1 covers the principles that are required to efficiently conduct each of the steps that we walk through today. And we use an interactive case study format in small groups so that everybody gains hands-on experience in how to identify risks, how risk assessment steps work, how to develop good risk responses, and how to use that risk register to communicate amongst your team. And day 2 focuses on 2 elements. The first is how to write an appropriate risk management plan based on your project size and complexity, and then looking at the implementation steps that are needed to move from an initial pilot to growing the use of the risk management practices across your organization. So that classroom component is fully accredited by both CII and PMI. The second component is effective tools to meet the needs of your projects. So we've introduced a number of tools here today, all of which we include in that program. So the risk registers, the risk management data dashboards for reporting, risk breakdown structures, risk identification checklists. The third component is providing that facilitation assistance in conducting your first few risk workshops. And we found that a facilitator and training approach is the best way to make sure that your team on the ground has a great model to follow and can get trained in those facilitation techniques right side by side with our consultants. And the final component is that implementation support. And we recognize from our work over the past 5 years that implementation of any new practice is a journey. And our implementation support periods are generally a 6 to a 12-month period, depending on the practice that we're working with. So let's circle back to our original objectives for the webinar. How can CII's risk management process help you manage project risk more effectively? First, we've introduced CII's project risk management process. Secondly, we've highlighted both the benefits from both a cost and a schedule benchmarking perspective and how that could be applied. We've walked through the steps in the risk management process, focusing specifically on considerations that are going to be time efficient and most effective in construction projects. And finally, we've introduced our Roadmap to Success and the educational offerings to help organizations implement these risk management practices and start realizing these benefits. So as we went through today's webinar, we started with kind of the base template that CII has. And when we're just getting started in risk management, thinking on cost and schedule is kind of the easiest way to get started. But our templates that we use here at Valency also allow you to add parameters for additional categories, so quality, health and safety, reputation, and depending on kind of how complex your risk parameters are, that can be accommodated in those templates too. We tried to keep today's discussion fairly straightforward though.
For more information and to watch the rest of our webinars, go to buildforce.ca.